Hello. Well, it's finally happening. Peterson versus Peterson. Jordan Peterson recently had a pretty long discussion with Destiny. They covered tons of stuff. I first saw this because Destiny uploaded like a 35-minute clip of it where they mostly talked about vaccines and stuff, but there was some political stuff in there too. I do plan on talking about some of the things I talked about with regard to like political ideologies and like personal interests with regard to big government, big corporations, and things like that, because I think Peterson got it completely wrong, and I'm kind of surprised Destiny didn't have a better response to him. But I scrolled through some parts on the Daily Wire's upload of it. Destiny's video got deleted, I'm pretty sure, so I don't know what that's all about. But I saw that there was some commentary about the Nazi Party. Peterson basically floats the idea that, well, I'm not really sure if they actually were right-wing or if they were left-wing. I'm going to just play what they said here, and then we'll get into it.
I don't think it's because Hitler's lack of trying led him to kill less people than who ended up dying during the Great Leap Forward or during the industrialization of the Soviet
Yes, well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Well, what do we
because
consider?
It was a national socialist movement for a reason. And the socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
Well, but there was no, cooperatively formed businesses that were owned by all of the people for the people and distributed to the people. And I don't think redistribution was high on Hitler's list of things to do.
That's true. It was a strange mix of totalitarian policy.
I don't think it was a strange mix. I think it was a bid to appeal to mid-left and center-left, the KPD and the German Socialist Party by calling themselves National Socialists. I think it was very much like an authoritarian, ultra-nationalist regime that pretty squarely fits with. People get mad if you call something far right or far left.
You know what this reminds me of? I don't know if you guys remember Steven Crowder saying this a few years ago, but let's remember.
Alexa, who were the Nazis?
Historically, Nazis were those who followed the far-right ideology of Adolf Hitler, with political beliefs involving the superiority of the Aryan race, the right of German territorial expansion, and the exclusion and eventual extermination of unfit peoples from the population. In modern times, neo-Nazi ideology still advocates hyper-nationalism and racial purity.
Alexa, what does Nazi stand for?
Yes, his entire argument is going to be because socialist is in the name, therefore they are left-wing. I just, like, the smugness that goes with his stupidity is just, it's literally unbearable. I could not be in the same room as him. I mean, the look on his face when she says that they were this far-right I don't think she used the term fascist, but far-right. Like, to deny that is just, I can't imagine how naive and how stupid you have to be. It's actually hard for me to believe that he actually is that naive and that stupid. He's just saying this because, well, I hate everything about the left wing, so let me just throw them in with the Nazis. Not that left-wing people don't also do that kind of thing, but yeah. I also find it kind of baffling that Peterson would make the claim that we don't really know politically, like, which way they leaned or whatever. Sometimes I feel like he's playing devil's advocate without even realizing it. I mean, all the commentary he makes about religion is like this because he doesn't believe that the Bible is true. But he goes on and he says, like, well, the Exodus had happened in a meta sense, whatever the hell that means. So why am I, the guy that debates like flat earthers and evolution deniers, why am I talking about politics? Well, I'm interested in politics because it's how we structure our lives, and so it's part of everything. But the way we think about politics, I think, is analogous to the way we think about the world in general. What I try to do here is, educate and try to expose good and bad ways of thinking. And because I have a degree in science and I teach science for a living, that's kind of, where I live. But I care about politics to some extent. And I think politics or political ideas are instructive. And again, they're important. It's, like I said, how we choose to structure our society. So I promise I will never be making my channel like a channel where we sit and talk about, ooh, what did Donald Trump say today? Or anything like that. Before we get into where on the spectrum do the Nazi ideas fit, we're going to define sort of right-wing political beliefs and left-wing political beliefs. Now, one of the most important books I think I ever read was The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. He has all this research where he goes into, these are the core things that people who are conservative versus people who are left or liberal, these are the things that they tend to value. He finds that there are like these 6 sort of moral intuitions or pillars, and to what degree somebody ranks these as important or unimportant does a pretty good job of explaining whether you are conservative or liberal. So those are care and harm, fairness and cheating, loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, sanctity and degradation, and liberty and oppression. If you're not familiar with his work, it's really interesting, and sometimes it's really funny because he proposes these like moral dilemma questions that are just absolutely absurd. Like, if somebody has sex with a chicken carcass before he cooks it and nothing bad happens and nobody ever knows about it, is that good, bad, or neutral? Now, people that are right-wing who tend to be obsessed with like purity and sanctity and degradation and all those kinds of things, they say, no, this is like a horrendous act, even though it really has no consequence. And left-wing people who tend to be like, I mean, people should do whatever they want as long as it doesn't harm somebody. I don't like it, I wouldn't recommend it, but I don't find that there's anything wrong with it. That's just one example. There are tons of absurd examples. I think you can actually take a survey on his website where you get asked those kinds of questions and what your answer to them will be. And then it tells you where you fall on the spectrum. So we're going to begin with right-wing political beliefs. So the research suggests that conservatives or right-wingers, they tend to value all 6 of those moral foundations, those pillars, in fairly equally, but they do have stronger emphases on things like loyalty and authority and sanctity. Now, I think that this makes perfect sense because the right-wing political landscape tends to be a little more authoritarian. We also have the marriage of like evangelical Christianity, at least in America, with the right wing. And that's where a lot of the purity and sanctity comes from. To unpack this a little more, with regard to tradition and social stability, right-wingers tend to uphold traditional social structures and norms. They hold them in higher regard, and they value continuity over change. I think you can pretty clearly see how religiosity fits into there as well, but then there's always this reverence for, the founding fathers and what the original intent was. And the social norms, I mean, they really resist social changes. That's not like duh, everybody knows that. With regard to respect for authority, there's a high emphasis on the importance of social hierarchies within that realm as well, and then respect for established authorities. This has always been kind of funny to me because these are the people that fly the "don't tread on me" flags, but they're also the people that it's the left wing that speaks out against police brutality. You'd think the right wing would be on this because they're always raving about politicians and their overreach and all that kind of stuff. But who enforces the laws that Congress gives us? It's the police. And they just kind of seem to be bootlickers in that sense. Conservatives also prioritize having loyalty to your group, your nation, or your community. And then that leads to strong senses of patriotism and nationalism. And I think that's kind of what gives right-wingers a huge advantage. They're way more cohesive, and they have the underlying structures like of churches and all of that to sort of keep them united. With regard to like moral sanctity, right-wingers, they value purity and sanctity. We already talked about that. So that's tied heavily to religious beliefs and moral codes. And then with respect to personal responsibility and liberty, right-wingers advocate for individual freedom. I would say left-wingers do too. But the difference is that it's within the context of traditional norms and senses. A lot of right-wingers, they say like the government doesn't give you rights, you have those. So a left-winger would want to promote liberty maybe through a constitutional amendment or having some sort, like getting some sort of bill passed that accomplishes X, Y, or Z. Whereas right-wingers, they sort of, I don't know, they think it's not that they disagree, they just think that it shouldn't be the government's job. Like a lot of these people, they don't think that businesses should discriminate against people based on their race, but they think that it shouldn't be illegal to do it. I don't know why they think that that would build a better world. History tells us that it doesn't work that way, but whatever. Okay, so with regard to the left wing, so in the scope of empathy and care, left-wingers, we prioritize welfare and caring for vulnerable people. We advocate for social systems that try to prevent harm and promote equality. With regard to equality and fairness, there's this big push for social justice and equality. In order to accomplish that, there are redistributive policies that are often pushed for. Left-wingers are more willing to challenge authority and to question authority. So this is the pushback against the established authorities and established ideas as well. Left-wingers are more open to change. So they value diversity. Diversity is our strength, remember? There's a higher degree of open-mindedness and willing to change social norms, as long as it's in the pursuit of, a goal that's supposed to maximize equality or reduce harm. And left-wingers, they also value individual freedom, but more so in the sense of personal autonomy and rights, especially concerning lifestyle choices. Now, I go over all of that to set the stage. We don't really have to speculate and wonder too much what the Nazi plan and ideology was, because they were in power for a long time, and they had a National Socialist program. It was a 25-point program. The 23rd point actually has 3 within it, so technically it's more like 27. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go over every single part, because these were the official policies and programs and things that the Nazi Party wanted to enact. We're not relying on what words are contained within the acronym, like what some sort of idiot would do. And we're not going to sit here and compare Hitler's speeches to speeches made by other political candidates to see if it matches. Oh, guys, look, it's my cat. No, we're going to go through the actual policy bit by bit and see where it falls on the political spectrum. Before that, though, there is one other thing I want to go over, and that's what fascism is. So it's been debated and argued whether or not the Nazi Party was actually fascist or not. It clearly had the majority of the sort of aspects of it, but was it full-blown fascism? Who knows? I'm going to read to you a paragraph that summarizes fascism. Now, what's not arguable is whether or not fascism falls on the right or left end of the spectrum. It's certainly far right. That is known. But I want you to just keep this in mind as we go through these things and say to yourself, yeah, does that sound like what they were doing? Fascism is a far-right political ideology characterized by authoritarian power, dictatorial leadership, and the suppression of opposition. It emphasizes extreme nationalism, often with a focus on racial or ethnic superiority, and advocates for a centralized autocratic government led by a dictatorial leader. Fascism rejects democratic governance and liberal values, promoting instead a totalitarian state that controls many aspects of life, including the economy, education, and the media, to maintain its power and propagate its ideology. The fascist regime typically uses propaganda, censorship, and state-sponsored terror to enforce conformity and eliminate dissent, all in the name of national unity and revitalization. To help us out, I've created this, the teeter-totter of political ideas. Whatever. So we have a balance in the middle with, I'm just going to call these centralist ideas that anybody right or left would agree on. And then we have right-leaning, far-right, left-leaning, and far-left ideas. Now, again, we have that 25, which is really a 27-point National Socialist program that the Nazis had. We're going to place every single idea where it belongs on the political teeter-totter. We'll go through about 5 ideas at a time, and then after we talk about the ideas, we'll show where they go on the teeter-totter, and then we'll see is more weight on the right, the left, or the center at the end. First thing, we demand the union of all Germans from the Greater Germany on the basis of people's right to self-determination enjoyed by the nations. I think this is pretty clearly right down the middle. I would call this centrist. Number 2, we demand equality of rights for the German people in its dealings with other nations and abolition of the peace treaty of Versailles and Saint-Germain. Again, I view that to be pretty much centrist. Treaty of Versailles, that's what gave Germany a crippling and horrendous debt after World War I. They were fined like $33 billion or something like that. But again, I would say that's right down the middle. Number 3, we demand land and territory for the sustenance of our people and colonization for our surplus population. That, I think, is pretty clearly far right. I wouldn't call it extreme. I just would say it's more extreme than simply right-leaning. I mean, you're talking about, and this is what they did, going to places outside their borders and taking that land for themselves. That reeks of what Moses was doing in the Old Testament. It reeks of sort of like manifest destiny, but even more extreme than that. And again, why were they doing this? Well, they were trying to claim it to build up a strong nation that had a strong national identity. Number 4, none but members of the nation may be citizens of the state. None but those of German blood, whatever their creed may be. No Jew, therefore, may be a member of the nation. This is about as far to the right as you're going to see. And number 5, whoever has no citizenship is to be able to live in Germany only as a guest and must be regarded as being subject to foreign laws. So I would call this centrist, but I would say that it's a little bit right-leaning. Now, I am approaching this from the political arena that we have today. I would say, close to 100 years ago when this was all laid out, this probably would be a little bit more centrist. But anyways, that's how I would characterize it. By all means, feel free to disagree with me if you want. But I think we have 2 ideas right down the middle, right-leaning, and then, like I said, number 4, that's as far to the right as you're going to get. And then number 3, I would put that in the far right as well. Number 6, the right of voting on the state's government and legislation is to be enjoyed by the citizens of the state alone. We demand, therefore, that all official appointments of whatever kind shall be granted to citizens of the state alone. We oppose the corrupting custom of Parliament of filling posts merely with a view to party considerations and without reference to character or capability. The way I read this, I would call this right-leaning. For the most part, it sounds pretty centrist, kind of down the middle. It sounds like common sense. But at the end, it sort of sounds like they're trying to put qualifications for the right to vote. So, for example, what do we see today? Well, liberals, left-leaning people want to make voting as easy as possible, a national day to vote. They believe in registering to vote, but you shouldn't have to have a voter ID because that's taken care of in the process of becoming registered. Right-wingers are pushing against all that stuff, but you also get ideas all the time out of the right wing where there should be some sort of test you have to take and pass in order to be eligible to vote. Those did used to happen, and there were tests that only black people were given, and the questions that were formed were so convoluted and so complicated that nobody could really understand what it was trying to say. I mean, it was just overt voter suppression. That's what it was. Number 7, we demand that the state be charged first with providing the opportunity for a livelihood and way of life for the citizens. If it is impossible to nourish the total population of the state, then the members of foreign nations must be excluded from the Reich. I am going to call this center-right. The first part of that, I think that just reads as good common sense. I don't think that's left-wing to say that the state's responsibility is to provide for its citizens. I mean, no matter what you believe in, I think like national security, national defense, and providing for citizens is what the government is supposed to do. This is not a description of the redistribution of resources or wealth or anything like that. I'm calling this right-leaning because at the end it kind of seems to me, at least, to imply we're going to shut off immigration if we can't handle everything that we have on our own. I'm probably living in the moment a little bit too much. I mean, even not that long ago under the Obama presidency, I mean, left-wing people did think he was kind of a hard ass on immigration, but it's either right down the middle or very slightly to the right. That's what I'm going to say. Number 8. I understand that says 3 here, but it's actually the 8th one. All immigration of non-Germans must be prevented. We demand that. I'm not even going to read the rest. This is about as far right as we're going to get. Maybe not quite as bad as that first one, but it's definitely on the far, far right end of the spectrum. Number 9, all citizens of the state shall be equal as regards rights and obligations. I'm going to call that left-leaning. I wouldn't push it very far. I think this is just basic liberalism. And finally, number 10, the first obligation of every citizen must be to productively work mentally, or physically. The activity of individual may not clash with the interests of the whole, but must proceed within the framework of the whole for the benefit for the greater good. It says, we demand therefore, and that's just going to lead into the next upcoming points. I read that as being far right, not like really far over. I have it just kind of on the edge of just after right leaning. In the beginning, it kind of sounds like, and who does this remind you of? Get a job. Now that middle part sounds pretty collectivist, but I still think that it's right leaning. And that's because of like the implication in what it says toward the end. It must proceed within the framework of the whole. Remind yourself of what is nationalism and what is fascism. And I think pretty clearly that's what that's talking about. So at this point, I think this is where we are. Are you starting to notice a pattern? Number 11, the abolition of unearned work and labor incomes and the breaking of debt slavery. I'm not going to go so far as to call this like far right. I find this to be right leaning. The breaking of debt slavery thing, I don't really find that to be liberal. I find that to be more centrist. Like anybody should agree that there shouldn't be slavery, you would think. Number 12, in consideration of the monstrous sacrifice of life and property that each war demands of the people, personal enrichment due to a war must be regarded as a crime against the nation. Therefore, we demand ruthless confiscation of all war profits. This one I'm putting right down the middle. Again, I think anybody should be able to agree that war profiteering just is a bad idea. Now, the ruthless confiscation part of it, that's very authoritarian. Now, there's such a thing as right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. Like, the seizure of property can be viewed as like left-wing authoritarian. I mean, if you're a hardcore communist or Marxist, that's what that would be. But if you're taking things away from people, well, I mean, the Nazis did this based on what your ethnicity was. Well, that's right-wing authoritarianism. I don't think that's really the point of this one, though. So again, right down the middle. 13, we demand nationalization of all businesses which have been up to the present formed into companies or trusts. This is pretty far left. I don't think this rises exactly to the level of full-blown Marxism, full-blown socialism, where there's absolutely no private property that's owned by anybody. Everything is owned by the state. It's not the complete capture of all of the means of production as well. So I'm not putting it all the way on the spectrum of the far left. I'm going to put it in the middle. Number 14, we demand that the profits from wholesale trade be shared out. Again, that's far left. That's redistribution. I wouldn't put it all the way at the end, but pretty clearly that's left wing. I find this to be very odd. How do we have 11, the abolition of unearned income, and this rule number 14? I don't really get what they're trying to do here, and there isn't a ton of documents or evidence behind what exactly all of these means that I could find. I mean, I'm sure there are books written about it, but I wasn't going to read an entire book just to make this video. And then number 15, we demand an expansion on a large scale of old age welfare. So I'm going to call this left-leaning, right on the edge of far left, but not quite all the way across. Social Security, which that's what this sounds like to me, is wildly popular amongst all political ideologies. That said, the only people that want to get rid of it are right-wing people. So most of those were left-wing ideas. Number 12, that goes right in the middle. And then number 11, right-leaning. Number 16, we demand the creation of a healthy middle class and its conservation, immediate communalization of the greater warehouses and their being leased at low cost to small firms, the utmost consideration of all small firms in contracts with the state, county, or municipality. I will be honest, this one confuses me really badly. I tried to look into more of what this is really trying to say, and I can't really find a lot of details. I'm classifying this as center-left. It's not talking about the wholesale seizure of anything, really, so I'm not going to call it far left or anything like that. Nothing about it really seems right-wing to me. It just kind of seems to be like, I don't know, a decent idea. Number 17, we demand a land reform suitable to our needs, provision of a law for the free expropriation of land for the purposes of public utility, abolition of land rent, and prevention of all speculation in land. I think I would put this just over the edge at far left. To expropriate the land means that the state has the right to take land that is currently privately owned and use it for public good. Again, this isn't the same thing as the complete abolition of land as property, so I wouldn't put it at the farthest extremes. This one is also, like a lot of the others, kind of confusing. I tried to do some digging to see what this really meant. It seemed like part of the idea was just to try to combat the horrendous inflation that they were suffering. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what I was able to find. I went back and forth on this one. I originally had it as just left-leaning, but I put it in the far left really only because I think that it may just be a blind spot I'm having. I'm not reading into this one as honestly as I should be. So I'm going to put it in there. 18, we demand struggle without consideration against those whose activity is injurious to the general interest. Common national criminals, usurers, I have no idea what that word is, profiteers, and so forth are to be punished with death without consideration of confession or race. I, as a lefty, would consider a death penalty policy like this to be pretty far right, but I'm going to put it right on the edge of right-leaning, not quite breaching into the far right. I'm doing that for two reasons. One, it's not the most arbitrary application of the death penalty I've ever seen, especially compared to the other horrendous things that they were up to. And second of all, if we try to place it a little bit inside the context of where it was, the most progressive person this long ago was not a progressive by our standards. So for that reason, I'm putting it right on the edge. Number 19, we demand substitution of a German common law in place of the Roman law serving as a materialistic world order. So I put this one in center right. It seems pretty neutral, pretty innocuous, kind of right down the middle. And you can even argue that because we're overthrowing something that's traditional, it could be a little bit left-leaning, but these German ideas are very clearly pretty far to the right for the most part, so I'm just going to call it right-leaning, but in the center. Let's review what we covered there. This is what we had before we went over those four, and then this is what we have after. So again, there's the before, and there's the after. Okay, here's number 20. I had to give it its own slide because of how much stuff there is. The state is to be responsible for a fundamental reconstruction of our whole national education program to enable every capable and industrious German to obtain higher education and subsequently introduction into leading positions. The plans of instruction of all educational institutions are to conform with the experience of practical life. The comprehension of the concept of the state must be striven for by the school, whatever that word is, as early as the beginning of understanding. We demand the education at the expense of the state of outstanding, intellectually gifted children of poor parents without consideration of position or profession. I went back and forth a little bit on this one. I ended up putting it center left. A nationalist education program, or a national education program, that could be right-leaning, left-leaning, or right down the middle, depending on how it's done. Now, if the purpose of it is to try to instill some nationalist identities or whatever, then I would call it right-wing. And I don't know. To what extent did they do that in Nazi Germany? I have not read about it. I don't know. And this really doesn't tell me much. I'm putting it just slightly to the left because it says that this will be at the expense of the state, I guess. And I don't know. That's just how I think about it. So that's one more in the center. We actually have quite a lot of ideas that are in the center. Number 21, the state is to care for the elevating national health by protecting the mother and child, by outlawing child labor, by the encouragement of physical fitness, by means of the legal establishment of a gymnastic and sport obligation, by the utmost support of all organizations concerned with the physical instruction of the youth. This reads very, very slightly center right to me, maybe just right down the middle. 22, we demand abolition of the mercenary troops and formation of a national army. That's right down the center. Now we get to part 23. There's actually 3 parts to it, so we're going to put all 3 of them in their own separate category. It begins with, we demand legal opposition to known lies and their promulgation through the press. In order to enable the provision of a German press, we demand that, it's called A on the official outline, but it's 1 here, all writers and employees of the newspapers appearing in the German language be members of the race. I'm not putting this at the absolute far right end, but it's as close to it as you can get. 23b, non-German newspapers are required to have the express permission of the state to be published, and they may not be printed in the German language. I'm calling that right-leaning. I'm not quite putting it into the far right end. Now that I'm saying this out loud, I actually think it probably should go in the far right, but I'm not changing up my graph. And 23c, non-Germans are forbidden by law any financial interest in German publications or any influence on them, and as punishment for violations, the closing of such a publication, as well as the immediate expulsion from the Reich of the non-German concerned. I don't know if that means deportation or not. Publications which are a counter to the general good are to be forbidden. We demand legal prosecution of artistic and literary forms which exert a destructive influence on our national life, and the closure of organizations opposing the above made demands. This is restrictions on freedom of speech. This is overtly very right-wing. I put it in far right, not as far as the most extreme ideas that they had, but very clearly this is pretty far to the right. This is where we were before, and now this is where we were. That was a lot of points scored in the far right and the right-leaning end of the spectrum in general. We are down to the final 2. Number 24, we demand freedom of religion for all religious denominations within the state, so long as they do not endanger its existence or oppose the moral senses of the Germanic race. The party as such advocates the standpoint of a positive Christianity. We're just going to pause there. When anybody tells you that these guys were atheists or whatever, just bring this up. Moving on. Without binding itself confessionally to any one denomination. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit within and around us and is convinced that a lasting recovery of our nation can only succeed from within on the framework. And then I don't know what this part in all caps is exactly in reference to, but this is, again, very clearly far right. I actually have this pretty far at the extreme end. Remember what we talked about right-wing ideas being obsessed with purity, tradition, and all of those sorts of things. We're talking about getting rid of Jewish ideas and things like that. They're not like they're not forming a national church or anything like that, but we say, well, we strongly want to side on Christianity here. And finally, for the execution of all of this, we demand the formation of a strong central power in the Reich, unlimited authority of the central parliament over the whole Reich and its organizations in general, the formation of state and profession chambers for the execution of the laws made by the Reich within the various states of the Confederation. The leaders of the party promise, if necessary, by sacrificing their own lives, to support by the execution of the points set forth above without consideration. I have this in the middle, just very slightly right-leaning. So we put all that together, and this is what we have. We have 11 of those 27 ideas on the right end of the spectrum, including 7 of them on the far right. I have also 11 ideas in the central region, with 2 of them being center-left and 5 of them being center-right. Right-left split for the center isn't really super important. I'm not really saying, well, because these are center-right, those technically actually count for right-wing ideas. With regard to the left, only 2 ideas that are just left-leaning, and then 3 that are far left, with none of them being toward the extreme end. There's also the political compass. Now, I don't want to put these ideas on a political compass, but that separates not just right and left, but also authoritarian on the top versus, I don't know if it's like liberal or libertarian on the bottom. I don't find any of these ideas or policies to be left-wing authoritarian. I find a lot of them to be right-wing authoritarian, though. In conclusion, I don't think that this is actually very controversial. Some of these ideas, I think you could shuffle them around a little bit, but we're not going to get away from that they were not overtly to the far right on a lot of core ideas. Thanks for checking out this video. You guys kind of already know this, but I do have merchandise. I'm actually wearing one of my shirts today. Real planets have curves. My book is out. Support on Patreon if you can, so I can keep making awesome videos like this. I put a lot of time and effort into these, so I would really appreciate that. My videos are available 36 hours early without any ads on Patreon, so if you could check me out there too, that would be a big help. Thanks for watching.